Morning, Mr. Arlinghouse. Today is Wednesday, April 21st, and yes, that's correct. No more free Wednesdays. But today we are pushing on, wrapping up the actual World War II. And so let us begin. By the way, Mr. Arlinghouse, you like my picture? Yes. I mean, you see that once again, that's me. Of course, this picture was taken in early 1990. But yeah, that is me. I'm telling you, that was one of the coolest things I ever did in my life, Mr. Arlinghouse. And so, let us begin. So, Nazi Germany, with the Russians closing in from the east and the Brits and Americans closing in from the west, would last about half a year in 1945. As you know, and see, once again, these are the kind of details that AP Euro doesn't really get into. So yes, June 6, 1944, D-Day. If you want to find out more about it, watch Saving Private Ryan. But I'm telling you, Mr. Arlinghouse, I don't know if you got to see that on the big screen. That's where you should have seen it. If it ever comes back to the big screen, we need to go see it. This opened the second front that the Russians had been, screaming for because, and the Russians, you can't really blame them for this. The Russians had been bearing the brunt of fighting the Nazis since 1940. 1940. And the British and the Americans basically sat on their island and kind of watched from a distance. But by launching the invasion on D-Day, this opened up that second front, divided Germany's attention, and accelerated the end of the war. Yes, Dwight David Eisenhower, and I'm going to sneeze, Mr. Longhouse, commanded the assault. Why don't we... Sorry. And I'm back, at least momentarily, Mr. Arlinghouse. So, Dwight David Eisenhower commanded the assault and commanded all Allied forces in at least Western Europe. In August of 1944, the Allies landed in southern France, a second actual D-Day. And by September, pause. I'm going to pause again, Mr. Arlinghouse. Finally back, Mr. Arlinghouse. Let me get back to what I was doing. So, in August, like I said there, the Allies launched a second, the Allies, the British and the Americans launched a second offensive there in southern France, a second D-Day that really gets almost no press at all. And by September, France was liberated. The Germans launched a massive counteroffensive in the west in December and threw the Allies back. This is the so-called Battle of the Bulge. This was the last gasp for the Germans in the west. The Allies crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, and it was literally a race to Berlin was on. Although by prior agreement, the Allies, the British, Americans, and the Soviets had agreed to allow the Soviet Union to be the liberator, conqueror, destroyer of Berlin. So, in the east, the Russians swept forward, and in March they were close to Berlin. The Allies insisted on unconditional surrender. The Germans fought on until the beginning of May, and as we know, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. I have the date May 1st, 1945. I've also seen the date April 30th, 1945. And so that ends the war in Europe. See, Mr. Arlinghouse, no details. We just go right through it. And that's what AP Euro wants. But the war is not over. By this time, the Japanese were on their last legs as well. And the longer the war lasted, like the Germans, the smaller the chance the Japanese had of winning. Because the Americans had done to the Japanese exactly what the Germans were trying to do to the British. And that was the Americans used submarines to pretty much shut down shipping into Japan. For the Japanese, as the war went on, every time the Japanese would lose a plane or lose a ship, uh, they uh, they could not be replaced. On the other hand, the Americans, that was the thing. They had the unbombed industrial heart, and by the middle part of 1945, the Americans were putting out a battleship a week. So replacing ships and planes was no problem. Another thing, and I don't shouldn't talk too much about this, but yeah, the Japanese were so wrong-headed in the way many of the things they did. For example, Japanese submarines targeted American warships, not American supply ships like the Americans did. And also, the Japanese would keep their best pilots in the air until eventually, the pilot's luck would run out, they'd get shot down. The Americans, if they found a pilot who was especially skilled, they would send him back to the United States to train other pilots. And, that way they always supply a fresh pilots. Interestingly enough, Mr. Arlinghouse, regarding airplanes and pilots, the Japanese actually ran out of pilots before they ran out of planes. So, and yes, the Americans began this island hopping campaign throughout the Pacific, closing in the noose, the circle on Japan. In October, the Americans captured most of the Philippines and drove the Japanese fleet back into Japanese waters. From their new bases, particularly Iwo Jima, the Americans could bomb Japan literally at will, using high altitude bombers that were actually out of range. And the Americans in Japan, just like they had in Europe, used napalm. I mean, Tokyo was a city that much of its construction prior to World War II was made of wood and thin paper, and the Japanese or the American napalm just turned that into a giant incendiary. Confronted with a determined enemy, the United States now closing in on Japan, and here's the thing, this is why we study this part. The United States calculated that to take Japan whole meant that the United States would lose 1 million dead Americans to conquer Japan. Because remember, Mr. Arlinghouse, and this is key, that throughout World War II, the British were at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan. The French were at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, or as long as they lasted. The Americans were at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan. But the Soviet Union was at war with Germany and Italy, but not Japan. Yes. In fact, until like about 3 days left in the war, the Soviet Union drug its feet about helping the Allies defeat Japan. And so when it talked about calculating losing 1 million extra casualties, those would all be American casualties. And as you know, Mr. Arlinghouse, the Manhattan Project, I should capitalize that, the Manhattan Project now had the bomb. The bomb. Well, that's odd. Isn't that the oddest thing you ever saw? Manhattan Project now had the bomb. It won't let me capitalize that. It was dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, and once again, there are a zillion details about this which we can't get into. For example, throughout the entire war, when the Americans began being able to bomb Japan, they specifically left the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone because they wanted to see when they dropped those nuclear weapons exactly how much damage would be done by a nuclear device. And you couldn't very well tell that if the city was already pretty much chewed up by other bombings. 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria, The Emperor Hirohito, the boy emperor who ruled Japan at the time, intervened. And, this is one thing I find intriguing. For the first time in history, the Emperor of Japan, who was considered a living god, condescended, lowered himself to go on radio and speak to his own people. And he told the people of Japan that when the Allies came, that they were not to resist. The Japanese, insist on keeping their emperor, and the United States insisted on unconditional surrender, but Harry Truman said, oh, all right, if you want an emperor, sure, have an emperor. And in fact, interestingly enough, Mr. Arlinghouse, the Japanese emperor outlived everyone else, all the other major personalities of World War II. I forgot to mention, Mr. Arlinghouse, that on April the 20th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died, and now Harry Truman was the president. We'll talk more about this later on, but, here's the thing. So Harry Truman was the vice president to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they were a contrast. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was New York royalty. He was from a long tradition of Roosevelts, power family. Then there was Harry Truman, a man who, at one point in his life, had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan from Missouri. And they were paired together as president and vice president in a political strategy that they used to call balancing the ticket, which means that you choose your president from one section of the country and choose your vice presidential running mate from another section to, gain support in a larger section of the country. And here's the thing. This Manhattan Project had been so secret that Harry Truman knew nothing about it. And so imagine you're Harry Truman, you walk into, or rather you're sitting in the Oval Office, and one day one of your aides walks in and says, Mr. President, we have something very important to talk to you about. And of course, what? Well, we have developed a weapon which we believe, if it works, will actually destroy an entire city. Now, the question you have to decide, Mr. Truman, President Truman, Mr. President, is that should you use it? And that wasn't a slam dunk decision. We'll talk more about that decision later on, but yeah, that wasn't a slam dunk decision. The bomb was used as a way to save American lives and end the war. Actually, in his memoirs, Harry Truman later wrote that the reason he decided to be the only person, the only president, the only country in the history of mankind ever to use a nuclear weapon was that if after the war it was found out that the United States had this weapon and then didn't use it, and 1 million American casualties were the cost of invading Japan, 1 million extra dead Americans, Harry Truman worried that he'd be sent to prison or accused of being a traitor. So, all right, let's go on. World War II was the most terrible war in history. 15 million soldiers died, as well as a similar, if not greater, number of civilians. Actually, the total of deaths from World War II was about 70 million, including the direct deaths, and then indirect deaths are deaths caused by disease, malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera. The end of the war brought little relaxation. With the new modern nuclear age, it was considered and believed, and I do believe this, that the next war could annihilate humanity. Conflicts amongst the victor nations, the British, the Americans, and the Russians, made a peace unlikely because literally, as soon as it appeared clear that the Allies, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, were going to win the war, they began arguing with each other about a post-war world. For example, Britain wanted to maintain their empire and increase it. The Soviets, of course, wanted to create a buffer zone of states across Eastern Europe. Uh, and the Americans wanted to basically withdraw as quick as they could. And it wasn't a good thing. All right. World War II was a complete and total war by the participants. Hitler had planned to defeat all of his enemies with a series of blitzkriegs, lightning wars, striking in the first few weeks. In the first few months, this caused little hardship to the German people. However, Germany's failure to quickly overwhelm the Soviet Union changed everything. Now they were in a long, protracted struggle, and the German people began to suffer. Albert Speer directed the German economy. And soon military spending took over consumer production, and German people began making huge sacrifices. Between 1942 and 1944, the military production tripled. And manpower was drafted into the war, and production suffered. By 1942, there were severe consumer shortages in Germany. By 1943, there were severe labor shortages because, once again, remember, Mr. Arlinghouse, the Germans would not use women in the factories like all the other combatants did. I mean, there was a British edition of Rosie the Riveter, a Russian edition of Rosie the Riveter, and the Japanese did the same thing. The Germans would not. The Germans depended upon slave labor, meaning Jewish labor, highly undependable. So, the Germans refused to put women into compulsory service. Uh, yeah, there was no German Rosie the Riveter. They refused to do that. They instead put foreign labor into armament production, meaning Jewish slaves from concentration camps. Highly undependable. One of the things, Mr. Arlinghouse, when we watch Schindler's List, that you'll discover, eventually Schindler will move. He's a pot maker. He makes utensils. He's a war profiteer. Well, that's how he gets into contact with the Jews. They work for him in his factory. But as the war went on, Schindler switched from making pots and pans to making armaments for the German war machine. But one thing, Schindler, even though he belonged to the Nazi Party, was so against the war that his factories never produced one piece of equipment that worked. Yeah. So back to the matter at hand. Closed down consumer industries and non-essential businesses like theaters. They used people from the conquered lands in the industries. Women were pushed into service as mothers, air raid wardens, farmers, but and were specifically instructed to engage in sexual activity with non-Germans. So what that meant was that there were no new Germans being born. Propaganda was stepped up as Hitler saw that Germany had lost World War One because of a lack of home support. Joseph Goebbels was the head of the propaganda ministry. He used mass media in the conquered lands, posters, etc., newsreels to intimidate his enemies and domestic populations. The bombings of Germany did not undermine the feelings of the German people, as they thought that these bombings confirmed the ideas of the propagandists that it was Germany fighting for civilization against the world. World War II actually increased the power of the Nazi Party in Germany. There were no serious, popular, anti-Hitler moves during the war except for one attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler by his by members of the military, including Erwin Rommel, Mr. Arlinghouse. That failed. The war brought great changes in Germany, but the greatest change was brought by the physical destruction, the invasion, and the subsequent occupation. All right, Roman numeral 12. The armistice. Who am I writing this for? The armistice, which had been signed by Marshal Pétain and Germany, placed most of France under direct German occupation. Hitler had left southern France unoccupied until 1942. Some collaborators believed that the Germans would win and wanted to be on the winning side. So, by the way, this is talking about. Nah, that's better. So, some collaborators believed that Germans would win and wanted to be on the winning side. Some wanted to sympathize with Nazi ideas. I mean, there were lots of people who believed in the Nazi ideology. Some collaborated to keep their autonomy. Most French were not active collaborators with the Nazis, but were pretty much helpless. The Roman Catholic Church favored the Vichy government. The Vichy government adopted Catholic views. No divorce for the first 3 years, and large families were encouraged. Some felt the Vichy government was better than the old liberal idealist government. The Vichy government encouraged a militant, chauvinistic nationalism against foreigners, against men and women who were not French, in other words, from their colonies, against Jews, which, Germany wasn't the only country that felt like this. The Vichy government did not participate in the Jewish annihilation, but also did not protest it. There was an individual called who was French and who helped the Germans deal with Jews. Charles de Gaulle left France and became the leader of the Free French, who operated from Central Africa and tried to carry on the war. Well under 5% of the French population seems to have cooperated in the real resistance movement. After 1944, the Allies seemed sure to win, and more people then joined the resistance. De Gaulle encouraged French resistance now from London. As the war went on, the French on October 21st, 1945, voted to end the Third Republic and adopted the Constitution of the Fourth Republic. Left over from this time was intense hostility and extreme hatred for collaborators, people who had collaborated with the Nazis. Okay. Why don't we end there, Mr. Arlinghouse? Okay. And good. We'll pick up tomorrow.